Welcome to Confessionalism and Poets of the Middle Generation. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And before we begin this evening's panel, I want to call your attention to the exhibit on the walls, which is really, I think, one of our most extraordinary exhibits. And it kind of straddles two panels that we've had. One was on Joseph Cornell last Saturday, and the other one is The Lure and Blur of the Real, which takes place on March 13th and includes Rick Moody, the artist Fred Tomaselli. Rick Moody, many of you know, is a novelist. And we are getting also the film director, John Cameron Mitchell, the film director, and others on an incredible panel about appropriation. So you can see, if you look carefully, especially that particular artwork right there, where my finger's pointing, that's by Eric Edelman. And if you read under the artwork, is one of the most extraordinary things I've seen in a long time. It's a beautiful sort of meditation on the kind of Cornell-esque box that you see there. And to me, it sort of competes with Borges. It's a really, Borges and Kafka. It's beautifully written, and I urge you to read it. And I urge you to look carefully at the whole show, which was curated by Hallie Cohen with the help of Adam Ludwig. So we also have a panel coming after that. Ed, what's the date of our placebos panel? In April, we have a panel coming up on placebos, and all of our programs are continuing, our film program, our poetry program, as you can see tonight. And we are very grateful to Anthony Lobier, who has made a very generous contribution to Philoctetes, which is enabling us to thrive at this particular moment. But we need your help all the time. We've also been the recipient of grants from the New York State Council on the Arts in Poetry, and the New York State Council on the Arts in Music, and the Department of Cultural Affairs, and we're thankful for all of those organizations. But we need the help of anyone who is interested in Philoctetes programming, because this is an ongoing effort, survive. And now I'm very pleased to present Michael Braziller. Mike Braziller is the president of Persea Books, which is really one of the most distinguished independent publishing companies in America. And it is specialized in literary fiction and poetry and in educational books. And Mike has been instrumental in creating Philoctetes' poetry program and bringing people like Ed Hirsch to Philoctetes. So without further ado, I will give the podium over to, not the podium, the spotlight over to Mike.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Let me introduce Ed. Edward Hirsch has published 7 books of poems for The Sleepwalker's Wild Gratitude, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, The Night Parade, Earthly Measures, On Love, Lay Back the Darkness, and Special Orders. And also here, just recently released The Living Fire, his new and selected poems, just released from Knopf. He's written 4 prose books, including How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, which was a national bestseller, and Poet's Choice. He edits The Writer's World. He's received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature, and a MacArthur Fellowship. He taught creative writing at the University of Houston for 18 years and now serves as president of the John Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. And Ed will be signing and read some of his recent poetry at the end of the evening. But before then, we are going to read some great poems and comment upon them. And do you want to... we're going to alternate the reading of the poems, but do you want to say something general? We're going to be reading from Robert Lowell, Barry Min, and Randall Jarrell, who's an amazing writer who needs to be read and needs to be better known. Do you want to open with a general thing? Do you want to leap into the poems? What do you...
Maybe I should start by saying something, if that's... Hello, adults. We're reading 3 poets from an extraordinary generation of poets who worked through the mid-century and are sometimes called the middle generation. They had a very strong sense of being belated of coming after modernism, and there was a strong sense that the modernists had done everything, and that they were a little late, and yet it's a remarkable achievement that I think we're still in some ways coming to terms with. I'll say something about confessionalism. The term confessionalism related to poetry was coined by M.L. Rosenthal in the 1950s, in the late 1950s, in relationship to Robert Lowell's book Life Studies, and ever since it's been hotly debated. And there have been advocates on behalf of this term, and there have been people against it. When John Berryman was interviewed for the Paris Review, Peter Stitt, the interviewer, asked him how he felt about being called a confessional, how he responded to being called a confessional poet, and he said, with rage and contempt. And I recently read two different pieces, one by Diane Middlebrook, who wrote a very powerful biography of Anne Sexton, which those of you who are in the psychoanalytic community will know about because she controversially got the release of the tapes from Anne Sexton's psychiatrist and used them. And Diane Middlebrook, who died recently last year or 2 years ago, argued in what was confessional poetry that it's a very useful term to talk about the confessions, the manic illnesses of a particular group related to Robert Lowell, John Berryman, Robert Lowell's students, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton in particular. And then Thomas Travisano, in a book I read recently called Mid-Century Quartet, argued that the confessional paradigm is seriously problematic because it underestimates the artistry of this work and gives a sense that it's just confessing. What I would say about it is that there's a more honorific sense of the confession, which goes back to St. Augustine, which is how I use it, through Rousseau. And that's the idea of using your work to probe a selfhood. And the only thing before we go on a little more, I'll just say beyond this, I just want to remind you that the modernist project, especially through Eliot and Pound, emphasized very greatly impersonality, the impersonality of the poet. You remember, if you can remember back to when you were an undergraduate and your teacher came up with the idea of the objective correlative, and you looked blankly at the blackboard, because T.S. Eliot had written in Hamlet and His Problems that Shakespeare had not created an objective correlative for Hamlet's interior feelings, and that the objective correlative was something we sought in poetry, and that the poet was always submitting to the impersonality of tradition. And these poets that we're reading today began, we're not really reading their early work, but they began under the sign of that impersonality. Especially their teachers were new critics. And they began under the idea of new criticism of the poem as a formal unit and entity. And I think that what they did was bring into poetry a broken subjectivity, an intimacy, a tenderness, a warmth, a sense of failure, a sense of fragmentation of the individual, not fragmentation as a poetic, but as a fractured self that wasn't quite present in poetry before. And they brought poetry down to a human scale. It's not heroic modernism in the same sense, but it's a great human accomplishment.
I'd like to let's look at the validity of this term as we read the poems. It'd be interesting to do so. I have to admit to a certain bias that I studied with M.L. Rosenthal. I did all my graduate work at his Poetics Institute
at NYU.
At NYU, and you know. And I was just starting to be aware, I studied with him both as an undergraduate and a graduate, and I was just becoming aware of the contemporary scene as he was writing inventing this term.
Yeah, in the New Poets. So you read the New Poets?
And the New
when it came out.
Yeah. And so I will defend it. And I conceive one, I'm against many generalizations in schools and things, notions. It's too easy to lump things together, but I do think that these three have something. They're exploring. They're taking something a little further. That's how I would look at it. They're taking away a mask maybe and revealing more autobiographical information and But the key thing is they're tremendous poets, and so so it's.
Well, this is what I mean about probing a selfhood,
Yeah.
but using poetry to do so.
Yeah, but you could argue that T.S. Eliot, was probing a selfhood. Well, no, I understand. Yes, selfhood. Okay, but it's beyond intimacy into pathology, into realms of pathology, and into realms of daily life, of actual, where they become the subject of the poems in a way that many of their
more radical self-exposure.
A more radical self. Okay. Okay. So do you want to start? Okay.
Mac Rosenthal headed the committee that gave me my prize for my first book for the Sleepwalkers. It's called the Delmore Schwartz Award, and it went to either a promising younger poet or a neglected older poet. and he said I was one, but he hoped that I wouldn't go on and become the other. We thought we'd start with, we just tried to pick some representative poems, and we thought we'd start with the last poem in Life Studies, a breakthrough book for Robert Lowell, and it's a poem called Skunk Hour, which is dedicated to Elizabeth Bishop, and I'm sure many of you know it already. Nautilus Island's hermit Eris still lives through winter in her Spartan cottage. Her sheep still graze above the sea. Her son's a bishop. Her farmer is first selectman in our village. She's in her dotage. Thirsting for the hierarchic privacy of Queen Victoria's century, she buys up all the eyesores facing her shore and lets them fall. The season's ill. We've lost our summer millionaire, who seemed to leap from an L.L. Bean catalog. His 9-knot yawl was auctioned off to lobstermen. A red stain covers Blue Hill. And now our fairy decorator brightens his shop for fall. His fishnets fill with orange cork, orange, his cobbler's bench and all. There's no money in his work. He'd rather marry. One dark night, my tutor Ford climbed the hill's skull. I watched for love cars. Lights turned down, they lay together, hull to hull, where the graveyard shelves on the town. My mind's not right. A car radio bleats, love, oh careless love. I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell, as if my hand were at its throat. I myself am hell. Nobody's here. Only skunks that search in the moonlight for a bite to eat. They march on their souls up Main Street, white stripes, moonstruck eyes, red fire under the chalk dry and spar spire of the Trinitarian Church. I stand on top of our back steps and breathe the rich air. A mother skunk with her column of kittens swills the garbage pail. She jabs her wedge head in a cup of sour cream, drops her ostrich tail, and will not scare. There's a note I'd like to read you, which Lowell wrote later, where he says, the dedication is to Elizabeth Bishop, because rereading her suggested a way of breaking through the shell of my old manner. Her rhythms, idiom, images, and stanza structure seem to belong to a later century. Skunk Hour is modeled on Miss Bishop's The Armadillo. Both Skunk Hour and The Armadillo use short line stanzas, start with drifting description, and end with a single animal. The setting of this poem is Castine, a sort of fading town at that time in Maine, coastal town. So the idea is that Bishop showed Lowell a way to try and come into what he said was a later century, something more casual, something more intimate, something more personal, even though she herself was not a very radically autobiographical poet. The casual precision of her description gave him a mode. In rereading The Armadillo, he structured it very closely. Right. If we had The Armadillo, he structured it very closely. Skunk Hour on that poem.
Actually, let's get into that. The Armadillo begins with, I think, some social criticism or some. If we have time, we're going to talk about that. But in looking at similarities and differences, I would say that begins with certain notions of social criticism of these people that are sending these balloons up into the air. But that the image of the armadillo at the end, I think, is different from the skunk, symbolically different or emotionally different. But I don't want to leap ahead. I'm sorry, but something we can maybe return to. That that even though both end on the image of an animal like that, I think this skunk represents something stubbornly within Lowell. And I'm not sure, I don't remember the armadillo representing that to her. I think it's a more sympathetic, or I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, I think absolutely. But the difference is that this poem takes a much more personal, darker turn. I think it's meant to evoke St. John of the Cross in the Dark Night of the Soul, where he refers to one dark night, my tutor Ford climbed the hill skull. And then he definitely evokes the lines from Milton's Satan when Satan says, I myself am hell. Yeah. And myself am hell, Satan says. And he says, myself am hell, nobody's here. So I think what he does is he takes the Bishop poem and he uses the structure to turn the knife against himself in a way that the Bishop poem does not. He models the structure of the Bishop poem in terms of the social criticism, as you say. His criticism are of these decadent aristocrats in a Maine town. It's sort of
this New England elite.
This New England elite has sort of come to the end of the line in a certain kind of way. But the poem turns from them. It models that social criticism on Bishop. The first four stanzas exactly the same. But then it turns to my dark night, my own dark night of the soul.
Right.
And that's a Lowell breakthrough, or Lowell different, that's extremely different than Bishop, who is a personal poet but is extremely reticent. And although Lowell was one of her closest friends and allies, she always was somewhat objected to the confessional side of his confessional side of his project. One thing I read about this poem recently, just out of the blue, I don't know where I found it, but I'd always thought where he goes up follows the lovers up to Lover's Lane and looks in the car. By the way, Frank O'Hara wrote a very funny thing about this, saying, what was he doing up there looking in those cars? But it turns out he actually got the anecdote from Walt Whitman. And it turns out at the end of Whitman's life, he liked to go riding out in carriages. And he and a younger friend would ride in carriages, and they'd follow along when they saw lovers. And they went home whenever they saw lovers in carriages. They were extremely enthusiastic and went home very happy. And Lowell read this anecdote and just put it right into the poem. Now I think that's one of the things that anecdote was very revealing to me, because it tells you something about Lowell, which is the idea of confession is you're confessing things that have happened to you. You're supposed to get a sense in life studies of the real Robert Lowell, but that is a construction. That is a fiction. And Lowell has no problem taking an anecdote from Whitman and making it seem as if it happened to him. And I think this element of the confession has sometimes led people to misunderstand something of the artistry that's involved, because he wasn't simply writing a confession down of everything that happened to him. He's taking something that happened to Whitman and dramatizing it as if it's his own.
Right. The one thing, again, to look for common threads on this confessional term would be also, I think these three can be scathing social critics, but I think that's part. I totally agree with you. These are great artists. These are tremendous writers. And coming back to them now and looking at them, I mean, they hold up. And I think these were the great writers of their period. But what I think Rosenthal might have been getting at was the relationship between their own pathologies and their sensitivity to society's pathologies. We'll be looking at that in the other poems that we read. And a certain, and I'm less certain of this, but it's a certain difficulty with difficulty with sort of the demands of life, itself, a certain difficulty in conforming in any way to what society asks of it, or a resistance to it, or at least that's what they project and they deal with.
You might say that, this is very much a poetry that changes its stripes in the late 50s. And you might say that America itself was having a kind of nervous breakdown that led to the 60s. And that the way I think your point is a good one, which is they're analysts not just of themselves, but also of the social fabric and the breakdown in the war. They were big. I've always been affectionate towards them because they were big supporters of Adlai Stevenson, who was a hero in my family. And there are a lot of references in.
Well, Berryman has
Berryman has that sonnet, oh, Adelaide mine, he says. Yeah. And there's Ike stakes a mausoleum in the heart of the Republic in life studies. And there's definitely a social backdrop to what's going on in America. And remember, Lowell says I was a fire-breathing CO. Because he was opposed to the Korean War.
Let me read a more, I don't know, more autobiographical, but a more a poem of more detailed
personal mode.
Of personal mode. Waking in the Blue. This is Lowell. The night attendant, a BU sophomore, rouses from the mare's nest of his drowsy head, propped up on the meaning of meaning. He catwalks down our corridor. Azure day makes my agonized blue window bleaker. Crows maunder on the petrified fairway. Absence, my heart grows tense, as though a harpoon were sparring for the kill. This is the house for the mentally ill. What use is my sense of humor? I grin at Stanley, now sunk in his 60s, once a Harvard All-American fullback, if such were possible, still hoarding the build of a boy in his 20s as he soaks a ramrod with the muscle of a seal in his long tub, vaguely Uranus from the Victorian plumbing. A kingly granite profile in a crimson golf cap, worn all day, all night, he thinks only of his figure, of slimming on sherbet and ginger ale, more cut off from words than a seal. This is the way day breaks in Bowditch Hall at McLean's, and hooded night lights bring out Bobby. Porcelain 29, a replica of Louis XVI, without the wig, redolent and roly-poly as a sperm whale, as he swashbuckles down in his birthday suit and horses at chairs. These Victorian figures of bravado, ossified young. In between the limits of day, hours and hours go by under the crew haircuts and slightly too little nonsensical bachelor twinkle of the Roman Catholic attendants. There are no Mayflower screwballs in the Catholic Church. After a hearty New England breakfast, I weigh 200 pounds this morning. Cock of the walk, I strut in my turtleneck French sailor's jersey before the metal shaving mirrors and see the shaky future grow familiar in the pinched indigenous faces of those thoroughbred mental cases. Twice my age and half my weight. We are all old-timers. Each of us holds a locked razor.
Well, there was nothing like this in American poetry before. And maybe in any poetry. The madness in poetry was almost always treated as a kind of sign of divine inspiration, not of mortal suffering. And this poem begins abruptly right in a mental hospital. That's why we chose it. And it's got a kind of forthrightness and directness that just hadn't been there in American American poetry. And this project of a more naked poetry is something that happened again and again in the 20th century. But that was certainly the idea of why not state the facts? Why not come down off our stilts, as Yeats put it, and situate a poem in a mental hospital as a literal place? Because this literally is Maclean's in the 1950s.
He was there, right?
He was there, and he drafted the poem while he was there.
This is the House for the Mentally Ill. That's very familiar. Is that from?
I don't know. Is that from a nursery rhyme or something?
No. What is the poem?
But mentally ill is in quotes.
Yeah.
Because this is the house for the quote mentally ill, and then he goes, "What use is my sense of humor?" Where I think that's very telling, because he grew up as all these poets began with what John Crowe Ransom called irony. They were all poets of irony, but here the irony is put to a human end, and you go, what good is it doing him? Locked up in this mental hospital, this private mental hospital, with all these sort of patients of aristocratic decline. You'd have to say. I mean, the Porcelain 29 was a club at Harvard, and there's Bobby now, and there's this football player, if you could believe that there was a Harvard All-American, he says. He's still kind of cracking jokes. I mean, in a waspish New England way. I mean, let's not overdo it. But nonetheless, there is a sense of directness here that was, I think, extremely liberating in poetry. I think that's why Mac Rosenthal was so excited by it, because we just no one had heard tones like that before. I mean, let me just give you a sense of how Lowell used to write. A brackish reach of shoal off Matticat, the sea was still breaking violently, and night had steamed into our North Atlantic fleet when the drowned sailor clutched the drag net. Light flashed from his matted head and marble feet. He grappled at the net with the coiled, hurtling muscles of his thighs, and so forth. I happen to be very enthusiastic about this early poetry, and I sort of go against Lowell in his turning against it. But he did write in a high rhetorical mode out of Hart Crane and Romantic American poetry, and so to break from that so directly in the 1950s was a very radical thing to do in American poetry.
Is it fair to say that poetry is fascinated with what's forbidden, for what hasn't? I mean, that style kind of works on itself? That's what I kept thinking as I came back to these people, is that there's a tendency always to introduce some new tones, some new sounds, and to go into a mental institute. These guys are never far from a madhouse. It's something new, but you have to bring the greatness of your craft, of your writerly ability to it. But it's a new tone. It's a new.
It's a really surprising. I think you could feel the excitement when you read the work of these poets in the 50s, because modernism had a sense that by the 1950s of having been exhausted and everything having been done. And so it's really striking to change the tone by being more literal and by being more intimate. I mean, in a parallel way, Bishop was doing something with Marianne Moore, who was, also a, wonderfully descriptive poet, but a very cold one. And Bishop is putting it on a human scale. But I think what's striking about it is that the freshness of bringing this subject matter into poetry was, I think, very, very exciting, and it just blew open the gates for what would come after. I mean, without life studies, Sylvia Plath's work would have been inconceivable. I mean, I can't imagine how there could have been Ariel or those poems that she wrote coming out of Lowell's workshop without this sort of opening the door through which she walked. Should we move on so we don't get stuck on Lowell?
You wanted to read another Lowell
Let's just end with Lowell, but let's not spend much time on it.
Okay.
I wanted to read you the last poem in Day by Day, because it's called Epilogue, and he evokes Vermeer here, and I think that's a goal for Lowell, and the kind of precision of the the precision of the poems. Those blessed structures plot and rhyme. Why are they no help to me now? I want to make something imagined, not recalled. I hear the noise of my own voice. The painter's vision is not a lens. It trembles to caress the light. But sometimes everything I write with the threadbare art of my eye seems a snapshot, lurid, rapid, garish, grouped, heightened from life, yet paralyzed by fact. All's misalliance. Yet why not say what happened? Pray for the grace of accuracy Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like the tide across a map to his girl solid with yearning. We are poor passing facts, warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his living name. There's a very striking thing going on here. We don't really have time for it, but there's a kind of argument taking place here between painting and photography, and that in a way he wants to write under the sign of painting, but he keeps getting drawn back to photography. And there's also, I think, the thing driving the aesthetic, that bewildered question, yet why not say what happened? Which has been part of the Lowell's project. Why not say what happened? It's a fresh idea, and odd that it is. But to actually give a name to the misalliance is very striking, and that all the paraphernalia of art, those blessed structures, plot and rhyme, can't come to his aid here for this new kind of poetry. And it ends with a kind of prayer, a prayer to Vermeer, to give a kind of element of supernatural grace to the fact that we're poor passing facts.
Mm-hmm.
So you see what I mean by saying that this is a human scale poetry. I don't think the cantos are. I love the cantos. There are extraordinary things in them, but I don't think you could say it's a human scale. And I think The Wasteland is probably the greatest poem of the 20th century, but I don't think you could say it's a human scale. Human beings are completely dwarfed by the overwhelming modern industrialization. Whereas epilogue, why not say what happened, or we are poor passing facts, that's a human scale. And that sense of a flawed mortality, of a flawed humanity, of human beings with all the mistakes they make, that's very moving to me in these poets. I mean, it's something you might think would just be taken for granted, but it just wasn't there in American poetry. Modernist poets, even my beloved Wallace Stevens, aspired to coldness. Pound's idea of the poet was the poet as sculpture, the poet as sculptor, and the poem as a kind of sculpture. Well, there's not anything wrong with that in particular, but that's a very different ideal. And if you were coming up as I was, and sort of modernism was mother's milk to you, there was a sort of way that human feeling was considered sentimental by the modernists. And they tried to embarrass anyone who wrote with too much feeling, say Edna St. Vincent Millay, or other female lyricists of the 1920s. That's another subject. Anyway, the scale is the thing I want to point to. The flawed humanity, the messy humanity. There's something to me noble in it, in the dramatization of human beings as poor forked creatures.
I'm going to read a Randall Jarrell poem.
Yeah, great.
You wanted me to read? I'm going to read The Face. Was that the one that we added just today?
Yes, that's
This is a poet that really is underappreciated, and some of these poems I hope you enjoy as much as we do. I mean, it's amazing coming back to them. He's really a great writer. The Face. Do you want to pronounce the...
I don't really know German, but Die Alte Frau, Die Alte Marschallin, I think is something like it. Correct me later.
Okay.
It's from Der Rosenkavalier. The old woman, the young girl. The old girl, Marceline.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Not good anymore, not beautiful, not even young. This isn't mine. Where is the old one? The old ones. Those were mine. It's so. I have pictures, not such old ones. People behave differently then. When they meet me, they say, you haven't changed. I want to say, you haven't looked. This is what happens to everyone. At first you get bigger, you know more. Then something goes wrong. You are and you say, I am, and you were. I've been too long. I know there's no saying no, but just the same you say it, no. I'll point to myself and say, I'm not like this. I'm the same as always inside. And even that's not so. I thought, if nothing happens, and nothing happened. Here I am, but it's not right. If just living can do this, living is more dangerous than anything. It is terrible to be alive.
One of the startling things about this poem is that in an earlier draft of this poem, Randall Jarrell wrote it from his own point of view. And he only had to make 2 changes to change the poem from a personal poem from his own point of view to a poem from the point of view of a woman. He added the epigraph from Der Rosenkavalier, the old woman, the old girl. It's a flash in a moment. One turns into the other. And he changed the word handsome to beautiful. Not good anymore, not handsome. And he just changed it to not good anymore, not beautiful. And the poem became from the point of view of an every woman. But this is Jarrell's particular way of handling. We're going to read you 3 poems, and they're all from points of view of women. But I think that Jarrell had a kind of displacement here of his own self into the female psyche. I personally don't think it's because he understood women so well. I think it's because he credited himself with a semi-feminine mind. I mean, I say credited. He said, I have a semi-feminine mind. But I think that's why he identified so powerfully with women and took on the woman's point of view. One of the things that's dramatic about this is that these poems are every bit as personal as the Lowell poems, but they have the slight displacement of the dramatic monologue because they're not from his own point of view.
Yeah, they get at a tone of quiet desperation.
Right.
And there's a very universal, very honest sense of helplessness and despair, which is very genuinely expressed.
You'll hear the same. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Just to add that I think all the women are concerned. They're sort of cool women. They're sort of asexual. They're sort of concerned with aging. And
they're all generalized in some way. Should we read the one at the Washington Zoo?
This is a great, go ahead. This is a great.
The saris go by me from the embassies, cloth from the moon, cloth from another planet. They look back at the leopard like the leopard. And I, this print of mine that has kept its color alive through so many cleanings, this dull, null navy I wear to work and wear from work, and so to my bed, so to my grave, with no complaints, no comment, neither from my chief, the deputy chief assistant, nor his chief. Only I complain. This serviceable body that no sunlight dyes, no hand suffuses, but dome-shadowed, withering among columns, wavy beneath fountains, small, far off, shining in the eyes of animals, these beings trapped as I am trapped, but not themselves the trap, aging but without knowledge of their age, kept safe here, knowing not of death, for death. O bars of my own body, open, open. The world goes by my cage and never sees me. And there come not to me as come to these the wild beasts, sparrows pecking the llama's grain, pigeons settling on the bear's bread, buzzards tearing the meat the flies have clouded. Vulture, when you have come for the white rat that the fox has left, better later to stare past. Oh, sorry. When you come for the white rat that the fox has left, take off the red helmet of your head, the black wings that have shadowed me, and step to me as man, the wild brother at whose feet the white wolves fawn, to whose hand of power the great lioness stalks, purring. You know what I was. You see what I am. Change me. Change me. This is a really striking poem, and it's the cosmopolitan Washington city of the saris go by me from the embassies, and it's a woman, a secretary at the Washington Zoo. And I think the thing that gives the poem its kind of depth charge is the ordinariness of the woman's sense of herself on the one hand, and the wildness of her interior life on the other. Which is a sense of being caged, and the sense of seeing the cages in the animals, and that she's in this serviceable dress, and no one sees her. And that's the thing that's very powerful in Jarrell, is I don't know anyone who writes better about, you might call it the ordinariness of aging, and the way that as you age you become more invisible, and are somehow desexualized in the way that people look at you as you get older. And Jarrell writes about this with a kind of wild fury under the mask of ordinariness.
Yeah. Wrote one of Rosenthal, to get back to Rosenthal, one of his books, Poetry in the Common Life.
Yes.
And more than Lowell, Jarrell gets at this, what I think what you're referring to is through colloquial speech getting at the process of an ordinary person, going through, and with tremendous sympathy and
Marianne Moore said that she wanted to write in plain American that even cats and dogs can read. And I think that of all these poets, Jarrell is the one who wanted most to write in the plain American that even cats and dogs can read. There's a very strong vernacular impulse. He's the most influenced by Williams of the poets we're...
Right, I didn't know, but that makes great sense.
Of the poets we're reading. And I think there's a more idiomatic sense of the pleasures of the way of American speech in this poetry. But I think that's a pull on all these poets in their turn to something a more common vernacular. But this is a streak. I think Rosenthal picks this up. This is a streak in poetry sort of coming from Wordsworth.
Right.
Coming from Wordsworth, but Jarrell is maybe in touch with something that, I mean, Lowell is always an aristocrat. He has a strong sense of being a Lowell. And Jarrell comes from an ordinary Southern family. It doesn't have that feeling. Should we go to next day?
Yep.
How are we doing for time?
Good.
Good. Okay.
Well,
that's helpful.
That's.
Yeah. But our night is not.
I'd like to add to what Ed was saying there, and think of this as we read the poem. That point I tried to make earlier. This notion of the scathing look at the sterility of American consumer society, with this tremendous psychological loneliness of the speaker. The two sort of pathologies. Just, I know it's a generalization, but the political awareness and the distaste for American culture and society, American society, seems to have a reciprocity with the speaker's own pathology. Next day. Moving from cheer to joy, from joy to all, I take a box and add it to my wild rice, my Cornish game hens. The slacked or shorted, basketed, identical food-gathering flocks are selves I overlook. Wisdom, said William James, is learning what to overlook. And I am wise, if that is wisdom. Yet somehow, as I buy all from these shelves, and the boy takes it to my station wagon, what I become troubles me, even if I shut my eyes. When I was young and miserable and pretty and poor, I'd wish what all girls wish, to have a husband, a house, and children. Now that I'm old, my wish is womanish, that the boy putting groceries in my car see me. It bewilders me he doesn't see me. For so many years I was good enough to eat. The world looked at me and its mouth watered. How often they have undressed me, the eyes of strangers, and holding their flesh within my flesh, their vile imaginings within my imagining, I too have taken the chance of life. Now the boy pats my dog and we start home. Now I am good. The last mistaken, ecstatic, accidental bliss, the blind happiness that, bursting, leaves upon the palm some soap and water. It was so long ago, back in some gay 20s, 90s, I don't know. Today I miss my lovely daughter away at school, my sons away at school. My husband away at work, I wish for them. The dog, the maid, and I go through the sure, unvarying days at home in them. As I look at my life, I am afraid only that it will change as I am changing. I am afraid this morning of my face. It looks at me from the rearview mirror with the eyes I hate, the smile I hate. Its plain, blind look of great discovery repeats to me, "You're old. That's all. I'm old." And yet I'm afraid, as I was at the funeral I went to yesterday, my friend's cold, made-up face, granite among its flowers, her undressed, operated-on, dressed body were my face and body. As I think of her, I hear her telling me how young I seem. I am exceptional. I think of all I have. But really, no one is exceptional. No one has anything. I'm anybody. I stand beside my grave, confused with my life. It is commonplace and solitary.
Terrific poem.
Yeah.
Terrific poem. It takes most of the poem to find out that her best friend died. This is the day after the funeral. It's the next day. But that extraordinary ending about confused by my life, which is commonplace and solitary. There aren't many poets who are able to dramatize this kind of experience, to take their personal experiences and project them into a kind of every person. And Jarrell's gift is this projection for a sense of something that is solitary but also common, that he's trying to dramatize a person who's exceptional and also someone who's not exceptional, like all of us. And it has that wonderful idiomatic moment where I hear my friend telling me, "You are exceptional." She goes, "I am exceptional." And he goes, "But really, no one is exceptional. No one."
Well,
has
it's almost
anything."
like when you're young, you could believe something like
That's
that.
right.
You know, when she was. That's what a great line. When I was young, when I was young and miserable and pretty and poor, you know.
I'd wish what all girls wish.
Yeah. But now that this aging process is dealt with in the poem, in the sense that she's not as beautiful as she once was, and she's wiser now, there's also, she won't fall for the line that she is, that she is exceptional. It's a fact, and it's like the Lowell line you read of we're all just passing facts. Is that?
Yeah, we're poor passing facts.
Yeah.
Yes, there's that sense of it. So there's a kind of empathy here for being ordinary, extremely unusual in the history of poetry, which is all about the exceptional. And I think there's a sense here of the confusion of being an ordinary person, and I think quite convincingly dramatized. Maybe the speaker in this wouldn't have known William James quite as well as Randall Jarrell did, but or maybe took quite as much pleasure as he does in the names of the detergents, moving from cheer to joy, from joy to all. You know, the kind of American poetry in that. It's quite striking. He's a wonderful critic, by the way. I hope you know Poetry in the Age. He was the most brilliant critic of his generation and gave us the first readings of many of these poets. Should we go on to Berriman?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I knew what time it was.
What time?
10 of it. Okay, then we are fine. But we have to leave time for... Hold on one sec. Just wait 1 second. Let me go. Which is the first one we're going to do?
Should we begin with one of the dream songs?
Yeah, were we going to do 29 or something? Okay, yeah. Okay.
We don't really have time to give we could really do a full-fledged thing about Berriman here and his movement. I really would have wished we could have had the time to read Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, which I think is a great breakthrough poem of the 1950s, an extraordinary poem about the insuperable difficulty of writing high verse in a country that cared about and still cares so little about it. But it's many stanzas and it's a long poem. We just don't have time to go through it. And Berriman doesn't excerpt quite as well in a certain kind of way because his project, his cantos are the dream songs, and you probably know he invented the character of Henry and the sliding mask of Henry, who's sometimes another person and sometimes himself. And he came up with this really weird, wild, exciting idiom, which is part blues, part minstrel show, part romantic poetry, part baby talk, part alcoholic drifting, part lyric poet, part Gerard Manley Hopkins. It's an extraordinary mix of things. And so we just thought we'd read two of them and give you a feeling for what it's like. And Michael especially liked this one, number 29. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart, so heavy, if he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good. Starts again always in Henry's ears, the little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. And there's another thing he has in mind, like a grave Siamese face 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. Ghastly with open eyes he attends, blind. All the bells say, too late. This is not for tears, thinking. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone and hacks her body up and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows. He went over everyone and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up. Nobody's ever missing. This is a weird poem. I think I know why Michael likes it, because it's a poem of such great anxiety.
And beauty.
And beauty. I have a theory about the dream songs, and this poem is at the heart of it. And I wish I had time to teach them to you so I could prove it to you. But now I don't have time, so you'll just have to take my word for it, or think about it later and decide you're against me or with me on this. But I don't know how much you know about John Berriman, but the crisis of his life was that outside his window when he was a boy, his father was found dead from a gunshot wound. And his mother was having an affair. He was named John Smith at the time. His mother was having an affair with someone named Berriman, and she eventually married Berriman. And it was officially ruled a suicide, and he was adopted by his stepfather and became John Berriman. But this sense of his father's death, his suicide, was extremely haunting to him, because he never knew exactly what happened. And as you probably know, he had many mental breakdowns, and he was a very severe alcoholic. And I think that there's some. I personally think I'm following Robert Giroux here. Robert Giroux thought that John Berriman's mother actually killed his father. That it wasn't a suicide. It was ruled a suicide, but Robert Giroux felt strongly that she had killed him, but no one really ever knew. But if it was the case, it was something that John Berriman couldn't bear to know. He was obsessively close to his mother, and the letters. There's a book of letters between John Berriman and mother, which I don't encourage you to read because it's so painful. But it's very revealing. But in any case, I think he keeps thinking someone's missing here, and no one is ever missing, but someone is always missing. And there's also a sense, I think, there are a lot of, in John Berriman, I think there are alcoholic blackouts. And there are moments where he just doesn't literally know what's happening. So there's the elegance and the playfulness of the language that's happening, and there's the movement of the meditation and the pleasure of the associations, but there's this underlying anxiety and torment which he can't quite name, which is what anxiety is. It's not. I mean, there's not a thing he's pointing to because he can't point to it because it's too unbearable. So I think he's unlike Lowell in this way. He's really a modern poet or of a modern condition because he's actually able to dramatize anxiety, which doesn't actually have its location anywhere, but pervades the poems. And my own personal feeling is that he keeps attaching his anxiety to different griefs. And throughout the dream songs, there's a sense of the high ones dying, of people committing suicide and people dying, and he attaches himself to elegies for all kinds of people. Some he was very close to, like Delmar Schwartz. Some, like Theodore Roethke, he was not so close to. But he keeps attaching the anxiety to something because he can't name it. And as a result, that's also the reason there's so many of them. Because the poems keep generating, because he keeps going around what he can't quite face. And it just keeps coming back to something that's unbearable.
Yeah, it opens. It's a kind of unlocatable grief.
Well, maybe I'll read it again now for you, now that you've heard my pitch about it. Okay. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart so heavy, if he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good. Starts again always in Henry's ears, the little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. And there's another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profile reproach of. Ghastly with open eyes he attends, blind. All the bells say, too late. This is not for tears, thinking. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone and hacks her body up and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows. He went over everyone and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up. Nobody's ever missing. You see what I mean? I mean, there is that weird misogynistic fantasy at the end. But there is a sense here of a pervasive, inexplicable guilt. Guilt over something that he feels personally responsible for. Some destruction of others. And that one is a victim and one is a perpetrator, but he doesn't know how to locate it. And so there's this depression and loss and guilt, but he doesn't know where to put it exactly. And the dream songs keep obsessively returning to this, and they make you return to it. And when I teach them, we skip around a lot. We read them in order. I ask my students to read them in order, but then we skip around when we read them, so I can sort of help people trace the sort of different moments and the themes. And you go from one to the next, and you see how obsessively he keeps returning to these anxieties. And I think it gives this underlying sense of darkness and personal agony to what otherwise might just be a kind of fooling around with Henry. And he also came up with, we don't really have time for this, but he came up with a very ingenious stanza or structure of 3 6-line stanzas with different syllabics that have this sort of power of a sonnet sequence.
Right.
But it's in 3 parts. And like sonnets, I think he found them a compulsive form. Do you want to read the one for Randall Jarrell?
Yeah. This is Opus Posthumous number 13. In the night reaches dreamed he of better graces, of liberations and beloved faces, such as now ere dawn he sings. It would not be easy, accustomed to these things, to give up the old world, but he could try. Let it all rest, have a good cry. Let Randall rest, whom your self-torturing cannot restore one instant's good to. Rest. He's left us now. The panic died, and in the panic's dying, so did my old friend. I am headed west. Also, somehow. In the chambers of the end, we'll meet again. I will say Randall, he'll say Pussycat, and all will be as before, when as we sought among the beloved faces eminence, and were dissatisfied with that and needed more.
I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
In the chambers of the end we'll meet again. I'll say Randall, he'll say Pussycat, and all will be as before, when as we sought among the beloved faces eminence, and were dissatisfied with that and needed more. It evokes so much of being a young poet, and you two striving young poets, and you want eminence. That was the thing they sought, and that was so unsatisfactory, seeking eminence, and wanted more and needed more, and were dissatisfied with that and needed more.
I don't know if did we mention that Randall Jarrell, it seemed, from what I've read, he committed suicide also.
Well, I believe he committed suicide. Mary Jarrell, who's still alive, has fought the idea that he committed suicide, and she's goofed up his biography because of that, because she's insisted on this position. He tried to commit suicide once before previously, and he was in a mental hospital.
And an injury, right?
He injured his wrist by trying to kill himself. And when he was in the hospital, he went out one night, checked himself out of the mental hospital, and walked on a road, and he either was hit by or threw himself in front of a truck and was killed. And Mary Jarrell has insisted that it was an accident. And the drivers said it was a suicide, but drivers do say that when they kill people, they often do say that. But I personally think all the evidence is that he committed suicide. Emotionally, it sure seems so. So that would have hit Berriman very hard.
Right.
Accidents happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in the Royal Bachman in Rome, whose blankets caught on fire.
Yes, it may.
We'll never know.
It may have been confusing to him too. We'll just never know. But I think the darkness of the poem certainly suggests that he committed suicide. That was devastating for Berriman. Should we end with the Berriman's Poet's Final Instructions?
Yeah, the Poet's Final Instructions, and think as Ed reads it, and we'll be discussing in terms of what now we know about his father and his own suicide. They are very strongly dealt with in the Poet's Final Instructions.
Dog-tired, sewer-sired, will now my body down near Cedar Avenue in Minneap. When my crime comes, I am blazing with hope. Do me glory, come the whole way across town. I couldn't rest from hell just anywhere in common places. Quiring and strange my Paul, I might not lie still in the waste of St. Paul or buy Dad's root beer. good signs I forgive. Drop here with honor due my trunk and brain, among the passioning of my countrymen, unable to read, rich, proud of their tags and proud of me. Assemble all my bags, bury me in a hole and give a cheer near Cedar on Lake Street, where the used cars live. This is an odd poem because it's so high-spirited. I mean, I think it's very high-spirited because it's got the kind of, he's sort of reveling in the gaucheness of American life, and yet this is the poet's final instructions.
Yeah, there again, it's this reciprocity between, he'll talk about Americans proud of their tags, which sounds like price tags and things that just buying a consumer culture. And it's like as he's leaping off the bridge, he's
unable to read.
Unable to read,
rich.
Proud of their tags.
And proud of me.
And proud of me.
And then there are these gauche signs for Dad's root beer.
When was this written? Was it
this was in the 50s. This was in his Thought Made Pockets in the Plain Buck, 1958. Mm-hmm. He died in 1970 something.
Right.
So it's very early. I don't think suicide is very close here.
But it's so predominant. Dog-tired, suicide.
Yeah.
Sounds like suicide.
Yeah.
Dog-tired, suicide. Very tired from thoughts of suicide. Suicide.
Oh no, this is a suicidal poem.
Yeah.
This is predicting something in terms of it's giving final instructions. I think this is the striking thing about this poem is something that's very striking in Berriman, which is the extremely high spirits mixed with the deep sorrow. And William Meredith used to say this to me about Berriman, that no one ever really captured how joyous he was to be around, especially in his wild enthusiasm for poetry and his love for talking about poetry. And I think that's one of the things. What I just read you is a very odd-shaped sonnet. It's a sonnet form with a structure of 4/4. And then 6, but it is a sonnet. It does rhyme like a sonnet. It just twists the form. And Berriman is very, very strong as a poet in fracturing these forms. But behind it is this personal anguish and grief. The thing that I feel strongly about in these poets, if we could summarize a little bit about it, is I don't think we should take for granted that tenderness is a quality in poetry or in American poetry in particular, because it's something that simply for long periods of time isn't there, even though it's so important to us as people. It's often, for example, there's very little tenderness in contemporary American poetry now, in my opinion. People are so ironic that they're just terrified of feeling. And American poetry is in an extremely ironic, campy, fragmented mode. I just think there's something to be said on behalf of a poetry of human feeling and a poetry of anguish and human scale and sadness and human sorrows and ordinary sorrows. And this humanity of these poets is very powerful to me, and I think it's not something that they're often credited with.
And it's also very brave. They're putting their lives very nakedly forward, and
they're completely exposed.
Right.
And they expose themselves in different ways. It was very emotionally gutsy, and I use them as a model because I think that it takes great technical skill to write poems, but it also takes emotional courage, and you need to continually counsel yourself to be brave. And I think these poets help lead the way.
Well, look at all the things we've said, observations about parents killing themselves, about alcoholism being,
about manic depression,
institutionalization. This is what you let yourself in for. If you.
These were very much forbidden topics in America in the 50s. And I mean, now they're so common for people to talk about that it seems unusual that anyone had to invent this or to bring it in. But one of the things that poetry continually does is enlarge its repertoire of techniques and put itself in touch with speech, but it also enlarges the subjects of what constitutes poetry. And I think that here, the subjects of mental illness, alcoholism, depression, crack-ups, and various things.
Was it you who were comparing or talking about Lowell's debt to Eliot, or is there? I read somewhere.
Wasn't, but I'm glad to.
No, I was thinking that in Life Studies there's a marital poem, an incredible marital poem, where he
to speak of woe that is in marriage.
I think that's the one. He goes out and visits prostitutes or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, just Eliot wouldn't. Eliot might have dealt with the same anxiety or the same sort of inner turmoil, but you wouldn't hear that. And in fact, Eliot probably did the same thing, it just crossed my mind that but wouldn't have never remotely thought of putting it into
Eliot's a remarkable case in his own right. He's extremely weird as a person, and had an astonishing inner life. The genius of Eliot, in particular, just as a parenthesis, was his inability to get us not to look at him. For example, in Tradition and the Individual Talent, he says poetry is a continuous escape from personality. Then he says in the next sentence, but only those with strong personalities would want to escape from them. If the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock was just called My Song, it would have been equally convincing, but you wouldn't have taken it as a dramatic monologue. He just took this sign of someone of the name Prufrock that he'd seen in St. Louis, and he just put it on the poem. Otherwise, it's, in my opinion, a completely personal poem. And I think Eliot is very much a personal poet, but by his critical dogma and by his use of masks, he makes it seem he ushered in a period of impersonality as a critical doctrine for the new critics. But he himself was an extremely personal poet. But he
you didn't get the details. You didn't get the daily life and the details.
Or he transformed them. Remember. Someone told Ezra Pound an anecdote about T.S. Eliot, and Pound said, well, he doesn't come in here dressed in a four-piece suit. He always made it seem as if he was wearing a four-piece suit around the stiffness and the formality. But behind it is a tremendous anguished person.
Yeah, right.
And I actually think it's very much there in the poetry, but it's disguised by just this sudden turning of the warp, turning it so that you don't see it. By naming it something else, by calling it the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Right. The only place it slips, really, is in the four quartets. It's a beautiful, religious poem. But I think one way to read The Wasteland is as the story of a fractured psyche. He himself was undergoing an incredible mental breakdown. But of course, he used, my theory is that he used the golden bough and he used all that structure very late in the poem to superimpose something on it, which actually it's a poem of psychological crisis.
Yeah, we talked about the four quartets here as a poem of crisis, but without the personality of the person that was having it. Here we get the crisis and the daily, the details. So I
love the harsh luminosity and the tenderness in these poets, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring them forward to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Okay. Well, hold on. The evening has just begun.
Well, not quite. Not quite.
So Ed's going to read 2 or 3 poems from his recent New and Selected.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
I used to talk to Joseph Brodsky about these poets, and we both spent a year in Rome at the American Academy when I was there, and I had coffee with him every day, and we often talked about these poets, so I thought I'd read one poem in his honor called On the Anniversary of Joseph Brodsky's Death, January 2001. Archangelsk, the briny cold, the frigid Baltics, children throwing snowballs at Soviet statues. The Arctic chill of the moon at midday, the trees wrapped, the pedestrians bundled. How the sun shivered behind the smokestacks like a soldier frozen in place. At the dimly lit museum of the far north, the subject was the poet's internal exile, metaphysics versus history, and the fateful struggle between poetry and time, a Cold War that will never end. Also his love for watery ports and stubborn cats, especially the Russian blue that hailed from the White Sea. Afterwards, a slushy walk, salty air, sleep in an overcoat at a converted barracks. All night I heard the muffled boots of an army marching through the streets under the thick cover of darkness. But in the morning, anniversary morning, I woke to a magisterial silence. Snow occupied the city. And then I'll read you two poems. This is in the honor of our reading a confessional mode.
Okay.
It's called Milk. My mother wouldn't be cowed into nursing and decided that formula was healthier than the liquid from her breasts. And so I never sucked a single drop from the source, a river dried up. It was always bottled for me. But one night in my mid-30s, in a mirrored room off Highway 59, a woman who had a baby daughter turned to me with an enigmatic smile and cupped my face in her chapped hands and tipped her nipple into my mouth. This happened a long time ago in another city, and it's wrong to tell about it. It was infantile to bring it up in therapy. And yet it's one of those moments, misplaced, involuntary, that swim up out of the past without a conscience. She lifts my face and I taste it, the sudden spurting nectar, the incurable sweetness that is life. And this is called What the Last Evening Will Be Like. You're sitting at a small bay window in an empty cafe by the sea. It's nightfall, and the owner is locking up, though you're still hunched over the radiator, which is slowly losing warmth. Now you're walking down to the shore to watch the last blues fading on the waves. You've lived in small houses, tight spaces. The walls around you kept closing in, but the sea and the sky were also yours. No one else is around to drink with you from the watery fog, shadowy depths. You're alone with the whirling cosmos. Goodbye, love, far away, in a warm place. Night is endless here. Silence infinite.
Thank you. We have time for questions. I'm sorry, I was so concerned with Ed reading his poems.
Yes.
Actually, one question. On that last poem you read, not your poem, the other one with the three.
Yeah. The Poet's Final Instruction.
Yeah. If he would have heard Bye Bye American Pie, everybody knows what he has said. What he has said, that guy, he got the idea from him.
You've puzzled me. You've puzzled me here. I don't remember what year was that song.
It was after this.
70s. It was late 60s. It was 69.
I have no idea.
Right.
That's right. As movies and popular things change so long, where you can say that they follow some of these people.
Do you think popular, the question is whether popular culture has been influenced by these.
Or it follows it.
If only. If only we have a greater population. I mean, I have no idea, but I don't think so. I wish so. I wish so.
Well, we have the reference to level, careless love.
Yes, well, that's another point. That's the other direction. Do these poets refer to popular culture? Yes. Does popular culture refer to them? But
I say yes to American Bible.
it's possible.
Yeah.
If you look at the writing of Joni Mitchell and James Taylor,
They definitely come out of this.
very confessional.
Yes.
And they wouldn't have done that. I mean,
Right.
much less Dylan was on a different track.
Yeah.
Certainly Mitchell and
Yeah.
Taylor. And as a matter of fact, when you're reading about the asylums, Fire and Rain kept bringing to my mind. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, McLean's. Well, James Taylor, that's right, it occurs to me. When we were reading law, I thought of James Taylor.
Was he at McLean's?
Yes,
right?
yes, and I think that song, Fire and, I've seen Fire, was
That's
written.
right.
Yes, he was in McLean's, the Boston McLean's.
This is going to be bad if you ask me questions about poetry. It's going to be upsetting for me.
You mentioned about the emotional courage, the specific emotional courage, along with the talent that these poets that you read, and I'm sure yourself, to put these works, these confessional works, into the world. Were there any poems that were found, or has it happened in the lives of poets, these poets, after their deaths that they deemed too confessional, that came out after it came to light, and how were they different?
Well, you know what about Bishop? I mean, wasn't that exactly the case with Bishop, or what a lot of the posthumous or the stuff she didn't want published, much more autobiographical?
Well, with these particular poets, the answer is no. I mean, there were poems that weren't published, but mainly because they thought they were weaker. It wasn't because they thought they were too confessional. Now, Bishop did hold back some poems, but I would say that there's a kind of sea change, a quiet sea change in Bishop's work in Geography 3, her last book, which is more personal than her other work. But she was always extremely reticent. I mean, even a very personal. We talked about this, the Villanelle 1R. Which began with her writing, "I'm so good at losing you, even losing you, your blue eyes." It just began, the drafts are at Vassar with an agonizing personal lament. But by the time it was concluded, it was written into this beautifully structured Villanelle, which she was more comfortable with. It's still a personal poem, but it's not in any way a poem of extreme venting of her own emotions. I have to say, maybe you know something that I don't know, but I don't think that there were personal poems that were hidden by these poets that came out after their death.
You read an excerpt from a Lowell piece, I believe it was from the war, is that correct?
The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket.
And as you're reading, I was thinking of the death of the Walter Gunner by Gerald.
Yeah.
And both extremely, particularly in Gerald's case, it's one of my favorite poems.
It's a terrific little poem.
That
yeah.
last line, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with the hose."
Yeah,
And
that's
I really
right.
brought it down right there.
Yeah.
Do you think that wartime experience, much like the poets coming out of the First World War, had a critical influence on them in terms of opening up and saying, "Well, the hell with all this, and after what I've seen, you might as well tell the truth"?
That's a very good question about World War II, and then I think the nuclear aftermath especially had a tremendous impact on them. Lowell was a CO, and so he began as a war objector and was sent to prison for it. Jarrell was a trained pilot,
Right.
and I think that had a tremendous impact on him. And his early poetry, you'd say the early poems, the poems that we read about women, the equivalent would be his early poems about soldiers, ordinary boys, basically, who were sort of flushed out of the trenches. So yes, in Jarrell's case, I think very strongly as a sense of devastation. Good point.
I had never heard about the part from Lowell in Skunk Hour being taken from Whitman, but I had heard in another class, years and years ago, and then we kind of did research on it, the class, that Lowell had a voyeur problem, and that Skunk Hour speaks to that. And I think there's another poem in Day by Day that alludes to that, and maybe even where it started and so on. And why? Is that also part of the understanding of people's working on the poem now, or is that something that's been
Well,
discarded?
I'm not convinced that he had a voyeur problem myself. But remember that joke from Frank O'Hara, what was he doing up there looking in the cars, does give you that sense that there's something a little creepy going on.
And in those marriage poems, he, I think, explicitly says in a few places that, he's out doing stuff late at night. And,
Others should know.
Like the rest of us.
I would say, like the rest of us, did you say? I think that certainly in that poem, Skunk Hour, there's a strong sense of voyeurism. I don't know how serious a problem Lowell himself had, but in the poem, you can say certainly it's a strong voyeuristic element as he goes up to that hill. He got it from Whitman. That doesn't mean he didn't have voyeuristic problems himself, but it is striking that the voyeurism that's taken for voyeurism by him is an anecdote from someone else that he got. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily. That thing about I have a friend who's a poet named Susan Hahn who wrote a poem about being in a mental hospital, and I was concerned about her. We're not such close friends, but I called her, and she said no, but she hadn't gone, but she fantasized about going, so she got all the brochures and wrote as if she were there.
Could I say something about that? I wasn't going to introduce a personal note. When I was at one of the Ivy League colleges, at least two people were taken away. One of them was a boyfriend of mine, and one was one of my best women friends. And she escaped from the claims and came back, sneaked into the dormitory, and said, I came back to get you. I came back to see you because that's where it's really happening. She said, that's the intellectual. I'm making the point that there was a kind of a counter life. There was a sort of elite.
Yeah.
And she said, we're putting on plays, we're writing poetry, it's so exciting. Wellesley's nothing like that.
Yeah. I hope you took a pass.
I had actually understood her diagrams and her craziness right up to the time they took her away, so I was a little concerned. She's completely logical and a very brilliant person. And that just leads me to another point. Just one thing that perhaps wasn't emphasized enough because it was so fascinating as it was, is the triumphant quality of these desperate persons. And I know that from personal contact with them, not with Barrington and Gerald. When Sylvia brags about how many times that she tried to commit suicide, she does it so well, she's going to do it again. And there's that quality in Anne Sexton as well. And I was hearing it tonight, there's that quality also in Cal Lowell. It blends into what I was saying just a second ago, which is that they, in a way, created a special coterie. Mm-hmm. In that sense, we're justified.
The elect
we can
of the
call
suffering.
it whatever we want. But
The elect of the suffering.
It's the suffering elect.
Yeah.
Suffering elect
Yeah.
who are so superior that they can stalk. I would use that word instead of voyeur. That they would stalk others as well as themselves. Mm-hmm. So they're doing it from a privileged perch, as well as from down under, from hell, and from the suffering, from mental suffering.
I would say Jarrell is different than
He's different. That's why that's
in his
him out.
quietness, in his common
He's quite different.
sympathy.
It doesn't have the triumphalist,
He doesn't have that
the
at
exhibition.
all.
It's a step away from an exhibitionist. This woman has been trying to get your attention.
This is a tremendous introduction for me. So, but I'm wondering that if Jarrell is in a confessionalist mode, why is it in the form of a female? And that puzzles me.
Well, I think that this is the thing about it's not confessional in that sense because you're right, it's a dramatic monologue. So there is a slight masking there. It's not Randall Jarrell. You're not getting the sense that you're getting the real Randall Jarrell. He's actually doing it through this other psyche. So you're right.
It's a very curious.
It's a curious
Well,
move.
it's the trouble with labels, really. Or with,
It's a kind of confession, but not as himself, or himself as another.
Is it, to piggyback on that, do you think that he thinks that aging is more devastating for women, and he thinks that
Well, that gives him
loss
rather
of sexuality?
question.
I don't know if it was an idea that he had, or if it was something that he identified with as a drama. I'm not really sure.
And it was also his way of getting at a kind of universal despair of sort of just human insignificance that touches upon a new chord, a new tone of...
But a poet I like terrifically, it was sort of an existential poet of the 1950s, is Weldon Keyes. And Weldon Keyes worked through the dramatic figure of Robinson. He created this fictive character named Robinson, who was sort of an everyman. But the...
He was a suicide too, wasn't he?
Yeah, well...
Yeah, I don't know.
He disappeared.
He disappeared.
He left his car on the San Francisco Bridge and Golden Gate Bridge, and no one ever saw him again. Now, when I was a young poet, people were always claiming they had bumped into him in Mexico, but he just disappeared around the corner, and he almost certainly committed suicide. But I think that the psyche of Randall Jarrell here is really interesting and hard to understand here, his identification with women, and whether he thought he understood women, which I think would be presumptuous, or whether he thought of himself as a woman, that's why I call it credited himself with a semi-feminine mind. I'm not really sure, but I will say this: it enabled him to say things in his poems that he couldn't say under his own name. In that way, he's different than the other confessional poets, because he needs the fiction.
I think what the first two poems that you read by Jarrell convey is a kind of extreme fluidity in his identity between male and female, and almost making the point that probably universally, that this is true of everybody, that there's a woman inside a man, inside a woman, inside a man, and that he's explicitly expressing that. It may be relevant. I think it probably is that the epitaph from the Rosenkavalier is about a woman who is in love with a young man who in the opera is played by a woman who in the course of the opera, as a man, disguises herself as another woman. So there is...
I'm getting so sexually confused.
That's possibly what he's
I'm in the right place, yeah.
I think that may be possibly what he's is conveying something of that confusion.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I want to thank you so much for giving me these poems. As far as the confessional, this kind of genre or type of poetry.
Rubric, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering two things. One, I noticed that there's men up there speaking about this confessional poetry. And I understand that from what I'm hearing, there's, a gay or homosexual poets, with at least men who have written from the heart, as you say, and from getting off the pedestal of poetry, which is, of course, of the times and wonderful. And I thank you for. I write both confessional, which I don't like because I think of it like throw up. But basically, I hear.
Thank you for that critical metaphor.
I hear the beauty and the construction of these poets. I mean, there's so much to hear, and I'm going to explore them further. However, this is the question I want to put to you. In music, as per this time, there's a difference between rap and the difference between the kind of music that soothes the heartbeat, has the music and mathematical components that brings across a beauty. And in that beauty we can extract it, because rhyme beautiful images become accessible on the page of some poets who presented them to us. And traditionally, those people that write from this sort of pedestal or whatever, of rhyme and spontaneous poetry, have, in my opinion, have brought poetry up to a higher status for the survival of the younger generation, for the beauty, to access beauty. And therefore, I'm having a hard time with the confessional poetry because, obviously because of the suicide and such, that it's evoking the dark side and the psychological disorder rather than the evoking the what I traditionally have craved in poetry was the something beautifully said. Not that these people aren't beautifully saying something, but I don't see a woman's perspective, so to speak, a healthy woman's. I don't know what I'm trying to.
I think I have some sense of what you're, what's upsetting you.
Okay.
First of all, we weren't trying to be representative. We just picked 3 poets. We thought of including Bishop because she's one of my favorite poets and she fits here, but we decided that she's covered so often elsewhere that we, just for time's sake, we could do it. We certainly could have done another seminar with Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton or others, and there are lots of women poets to do. So that would be one thing. So I apologize for that.
And also, we've had evenings here of Elizabeth Bishop and Sylvia Plath.
Right, so we just decided to pick these poets. But I think you're after a more powerful point than that, which is that I myself have often made the point that poetry is essentially healthy, not sick. And there's a wonderful anecdote that I tell in my book, How to Read a Poem, from Pablo Neruda, where he stresses the essential healthiness of poetry rather than the sickness of poetry. And I think my guess is that something that's troubling you, I mean, you're using rhyme and meter or beautiful language as an example, but I think that that's just an example. What's troubling you, or what seems to be troubling you, is that these poets are, as great as they are, they're tilting in a certain direction towards a kind of dark, manic craziness and unhappiness. And that I agree with you that you wouldn't want these to be your only poets that you ever read, and that there is a counterbalance in poetry of essential healthiness and goodwill and joyousness. Now, I think in the 20th century and in the 21st century, it's a little hard to find those poems. But the essential healthiness and the balance that you're looking for, I respect. And I think you're sort of making a point that there is something in poetry that these poets are not giving us that's about the essential healthiness of the human psyche. And I would say I agree with that there are other poets to read. These aren't the only poets I would read that give us some other affirmations. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, that's
that you're
fair.
looking for a certain kind of
the very focus upon the self, the very thing that we admire or try to bring out here, can be considered limiting too.
Yeah.
And that there's something very refreshing about writing about things other than the self, caring about things, caring about others, or experiencing love.
And
or
then
loving another. Or,
right, and then I think the other part of your question is women are better than men, and if you had some women poets, it would have been better. I think that's a fair.
And in fact, you could say of Elizabeth Bishop, some of the Nova Scotia poems, or she gets tremendously outside of her, the Booths and the Fish House. She gets tremendous, or Poem for a Poem. Remember, where she talks about her grandfather. She gets tremendously outside of herself, and
But still, if you think of like On the Bite and the poem, The Bite, and it has On My Birthday, and all this untidy activity, awful but cheerful. There's still a sense of, the awfulness behind a lot of it.
I just have two comments about two different poems that you read. The first one is Skunk Hour, and just the whole idea of using a skunk to represent the poet. I mean, a skunk is known for befouling its surroundings, and it's part of being a skunk. There's just nothing a skunk can do. Right, and here is the whole idea of confessional poetry. Just whatever happens, happens. And if it destroys a family, if it destroys anything, then it is happening. And the other thing is, in Berryman, when you talk about nothing's missing, I think, does he say nobody's missing?
Nobody's ever missing.
Well, I think it could be also nobody's ever missing somebody, in the sense of feeling regret, or feeling missing a person. So it's not just that physically that there's no one absent in the room, but also that the father disappears, the mother moves on. And
it's sort of a metaphysics as well.
Yeah, I mean, just the emotions of it is different, So that's it.
This is fun.
I'm interested in the bases for the traditionally non-personal poems and what in the culture, both maybe American, British, led to the feeling that, or to the ideal of a poem being a classical epic or using very intellectualized Greek mythology or Roman mythology as its basis for telling a story, until, I guess, Whitman started to change that a little bit by becoming much more personal. But could you comment on what it was in American culture and English culture, because I think they were interrelated, high culture that would consider that was poetry, that was the only idea of poetry?
Poetry is something that's historically determined, and so it goes through different historical phases. And I would say that the emphasis in modernism, just to take this for a more limited example, the emphasis on modernism was a radical break with what they saw as the sentimentalities of the Victorian era and a kind of a middle class or bourgeois morality which seemed to be false. And I would say that the Tennysonian ethic was something that was appalling to Pound and to Eliot, and I think that World War I had a lot to do with this. Remember Virginia Woolf said, "On or around December 1910, human nature changed." There was a strong sense, I think, during World War II, during World War I, which to me is the beginning of the 20th century, that World War I changed the way people saw the world, and that the old verities could no longer hold, and that poetry had to do something else, cut off from its popular roots. Because poetry was extremely popular in the Victorian era. Longfellow in America, Tennyson in England, the poets were extremely well known. But I think there was a sense that poetry was false, that the sentimentalities were false, and the poetry had to do something else. And the modernists conceived of the idea that poetry should be something that was hard, difficult, objective, and related to the fractured modern world. So I think there would be an era that historically the ground changed and poetry responded in different ways. Eliot said something very profound about this. He said, "Art never improves, but the conditions of art change." But I would say that in the history of poetry, there's a kind of vacillation that goes on, or a sort of change as things progress and move, that poetry counteracts itself. And so in one era you get neoclassicism, in another era you get romanticism. And one era then emphasizes something that's, remember Dr. Johnson said he doesn't want to paint the streaks of the tulip. He wants something more generalized. And then you'd say the romantic poets want the streaks of the tulip. They want something more individual. And so, I don't know, I think that there's a kind of conversation going on from era to era in which poetry changes.
Do you think maybe the crack came earlier with Dickinson and Whitman? And I mean, they sort of also in a wartime, but they created a poetry that was very different than what had ever happened before, and that was sort of the base for modernism.
The modernist poets reacted very aggressively against Whitman, but they were very much influenced by him. But on the surface, they despised it. And, I mean, Eliot and Pound in particular, were very contemptuous of Whitman, though you can hear Whitman's echoes in their poems very strongly. I think that Whitman was scary to them because there's a sense of contagion in him. And I remember their politics was fascistic. And they were extremely right. And Whitman, I think, is very much the poet of democracy. And there's a sense in democracy of contagion that was very unappealing to the modernists. But I think it's very much there in Whitman. So you take a poet like, a very interesting modern American poet would be Muriel Rukeyser. And she's very Whitman-esque in terms of her idea of no more masks and in terms of her embrace of free verse. But, I mean, Jarrell wrote a scathing piece against Muriel Rukeyser, and she was herself scorned for many years because of this sense of contagion. I would say Dickinson was very much loved by the new critics, but misread because they saw those poems as formal machines. And you can see how you could read them that way. So I would say that, Dickinson and Whitman are the forerunners of everything that happens in American poetry. They engender American poetry. I once was doing a program with Sharon Olds, and she said, American poetry is very lucky because we have a father and a mother. And then I came up with one of my favorite quips. Yes, but our father was gay and our mother was a virgin.
Thank you. Nice, wonderful program. But I'm finding myself curiously academic in the face of the intimacy, and which brings me to my question, which is, how would you differentiate these poets who are often lumped together with, say, Ginsberg, with Howell, and with Williams?
With Williams?
Yeah, but I look at Whitman, Williams, Ginsberg, sort of a chain of, but particularly with Howell, for instance, there is something different. There's something about this that I started to think and about other poetry because of your reading of this poetry. And there's a formal quality to this poetry also in my
yes.
But how would you, certainly Howell is a confessional poem.
Yes. I would say that Ginsberg and Snyder had an influence on this poetry by pushing it towards greater intimacy and familiarity. But I would say the aesthetics are different. Ginsberg's aesthetic, which comes right from Whitman in one way, is maybe closer to something like Charles Olson. It has a greater sprawl. These are the poets we're reading are formal poets, and there are formal structures operating behind these poems, even when they're more informal. And I would say that the structure in Ginsberg is the structure of parallelism. Ginsberg is getting from Whitman, who got it from King James Bible, the structure of the parallel. The long sentences that parallel things, and that's basically is poetic, and I think it works brilliantly in the early work and maybe not so successfully after that. But I would say there's nothing like this kind of open-ended free verse with the long Whitmanian sprawl that you get in Ginsberg that's quite behind this, but it's in the same sort of direction. But I would say they're more formal poets, more traditionally formal. Now, Berriman, Jarrell, and Lowell are formal in a different kind of way because, as you know, Ginsberg ultimately embraced the idea that he got from Trungpa, first thought, best thought. And I would say that's not the case for these poets who are heavily revisers. Now, they loved Williams. And Williams, especially Patterson I, I think had a great impact on the life studies. And you could say that one way to trace these poets' careers would be in a kind of shorthand as they began under the sign of Eliot and they ended under the sign of Williams. That is, you could say that the formality that they started with through the New Critics, filtered through New Criticism, came through Eliot. But they loved Williams and they embraced something more vernacular and American. Now, you might say there are different sides to Williams. And there's one side of Williams that led to the objectivists. And there's another side that led to life studies and the dream songs. And that Williams has, if you wanted to see, for example, there are two selected poems of Williams that were done in this era. One was put together by Charles Tomlinson, and one was put together by Randall Jarrell, and they have different poems in them. I'm with the Jarrell Williams myself. That is, I prefer the Williams of the poem "The Horse Show," which I think is a beautiful poem about a conversation with his mother about the horse show. Whereas the Tomlinson or the objectivist Williams, they like the Red Wheelbarrow. That is, there's a formal sort of avant-garde side to Williams as the poem as a kind of machine, as the new variable foot. That side, I'm not saying Williams is any one of these things. I think he's the combination of these things. But one side of Williams is a line authorizing a certain kind of experimental American poetry, and the other side of Williams is authorizing this other human-centered poetry. And I think they're different strains. And I would say Ginsberg definitely, he definitely comes out of Williams. And Williams is a big tent in terms of the American vernacular. But I would say there's maybe a different feeling or tone or strand in terms of what they lead to.
You'd said about the way World War I had changed the way people viewed the world and it started reflecting its way in poetry. What about today in terms of what technology is the way that it's changing the way we, the people view the world today? How do you think the internet technology and, how we've been living through that lens is changing poetry and the mindsets of poets today?
I think everything is up for grabs here. I don't think there's anything to conclude about this because we're going through such a radical change about this. And there's some people who, I just heard about an argument at Princeton just the other night about this, where someone gave a lecture on computer poetry and about using computer algorithms to generate poetry. And some people were really wildly enthusiastic about this. And one of my friends was very, very upset, and he stood up and said, "What I write, the computer poet called this expressive poetry." And he said, "What you call expressive poetry, I think, is about agency and hope, but computer poetry is about impotence and despair." Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that different people feel this way about it. Some people think that technology is, most of us, I think, are somewhere in between, but some people think that technology is going to save us, and other people think it's the enemy. And I think probably the truth is somewhere in between.
And one more question.
Maybe we should, how about two more?
How would you describe or locate the boundary area between courageous, gutsy confessionalism and self-indulgent crap?
Well, I think the boundary line between bad taste and good taste is very thin. The line between self-indulgent crap and confessional poetry is, I think, easy to draw because you're looking for something that's poetry. The thing about confessional poetry is, let's emphasize the part that's also poetry. That a poem is a made thing, it's not just a confession. And the confession, let's say the confession is not sufficient to make a poem. I thought that sort of went without saying, but we're not making diary entries. And when we're talking about confessional poetry, we're not talking about diaries. We're talking about poems. and poems are made things. And so I think that one way to tell, I mean, you still might not like these poems and you might not like these poets, but I think the one way to draw the line or understand the line or think about the line is it a poem? That is, has something been made? Is something made to endure, or is something just being regurgitated? That's why, I didn't like your idea about, it's just vomit. One kind of confession is just vomit. And that's fine to do to make you feel better, but that's not poetry.
I'd add to that, for my own taste, there are a lot of the Bergman poems that I don't like that much. I mean, we talked about the poem about Eisenhower. So, I think some are much better than others. Yeah. And so even within the same writer, some can just draw you in. You have to read it again. You recognize something deep within it. Yeah. And another one can be kind of gossipy and irritating and insy.
But I think the way you kind of can try to decide for yourself, I don't think there's any absolute canon of taste, but the way you look at it, you go, has something been made? Has something been transformed? Has something been made as a structure that lives unto itself, not just as a reflection back on the life? And so I would say you're looking when you're talking about confessional poetry, the part about poetry is as important as the part about confession. So last question.
I was wondering what the academic community thinks about the poetry slams that are sweeping the nation. It's not the globe. Poetry performances.
Yeah, I don't think I could presume to speak for the Academy. Because
I would tackle that. No, I'm kidding.
I don't think there is I don't think there's a monolithic academic community. And I don't.
What do you think?
I think I have a mixed feeling about it. I think on the one hand, it's extremely healthy, because I think it sort of brings poetry back to its oral roots, and it shows the oral drama of poetry as a performance art. In the history of poetry, competitions and debates are much more prevalent than anyone would have imagined. Some of them are in high forms, some of them are in low forms, but it starts in Greek dramas. You can go to Palestinian wedding celebrations and see poets verbal dueling. And the slam is part of something that has always been there in poetry. The Provençal poets used to compete against each other in competitions. The Celtic poets in Wales competed against each other in poets. I think there's something very ancient there, and slam poetry is tapping into that. Now, I would say the other side, or the darker side for me, is that there's also something to be gained by reading. And reading poetry, there are things that can happen on the page that can't happen orally. I participated in a lot of people's poetry gatherings and things like that, and I always ask the young people what kind of poet they consider me. When they invite me, they go, "Oh, you're a page poet." That is, your work lives on the page. And I would say that's funny but accurate, that you want it to live on the page, and there's something to be gained by written poetry. That is, when Sappho wrote the words bitter and sweet and put them into a single word, they left you something to think about, that you could stop when you're reading, that when you're hearing something being recited aloud, you can't go back. There's no rereading. The epics are oral. They're meant to sweep over you. But lyric poetry creates a kind of intimacy and interiority. And I would say there's something inscribed on the page that you get as a reader. There's a solitary experience between you and the poem that can open up something inside of you. I don't think slam poetry can do that. That's not to insult slam poetry. Slam poetry does something else. I think it gives us a kind of vitality and energy and orality in poetry that is very important, and reminds us that poetry is an oral art. But all I'd say is, on the other side, there's something in written poetry that the slam can't give you, which is a quality of interiority. And I think that lyric poems communicate to us because they're in language that is both solitary and also social. And that poetry delivers on our spiritual lives precisely because it gives us the gift of intimacy and interiority. It gives us privacy and participation. And what I would say is you can have that when you read a poem by yourself in the middle of the night. You can't have that at a slam. You see what I mean? So I think the slam gives us something really vital, really energetic, that has to do with wordplay, that has to do with social commentary, that has to give with something, a great democratic ethos. But there's a kind of solitude in poetry that's written, inscribed in the lyric, that gives us some of our own feelings back. And that means a lot to me in poetry. I wouldn't want to give that up.
Thank you.
Thank you.